Greetings, friends of liberty. I do find it highly unusual that now and again we hear calls for the state to institute or implement a system of governmental education. Robert Owen, the prominent textile manager, is one of these. Now, I find these calls by Owen and others unusual in that, by my reckoning, so very many of the prominent thinkers in this, the age of reason, have instead been either self-taught, educated by their families, or in private schools or colleges. Allow me to name some. Francis Bacon, educated at home and then on to private Oxford. American inventor and ethical philosopher Benjamin Franklin, almost entirely self-educated. Edward Gibbon, our historian of genius, both self-taught and going to private schools. The German polymath Johann von Goethe, in part, who was taught when younger by his father and private tutors. American statesman Alexander Hamilton, largely self-educated and self-taught as a lawyer. Scientist Robert Hooke, first undergoing his own apprenticeships, then studying at Oxford and finally being paid by the Royal Society to continue his research. The Scottish philosopher David Hume, largely self-educated and disdaining a university education. Dutch scientist Christian Huygens, until 16 educated in the home. Italian physicist and mathematician Joseph Louis Lagrange, learning his mathematics alone. Anton van Leeuwenhoek, that Dutch pioneer of the microscope, largely self-taught. The father of liberalism himself, John Locke, educated at private schools. American statesman and political theorist James Madison, taught at Princeton and on his own. Virginian George Mason, author of the Virginia Declaration of Rights. That marvel of music, Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart, largely self-taught and by his father. Physicist Isaac Newton, lots of self-study and private teaching. Common sense author Thomas Paine. That Enlightenment rogue of all work, Jean-Jacques Rousseau, either privately, more self-taught. And finally, that philosopher of the feminine, Mary Wollstonecraft, by her family, friends, and herself. Now, if we turn to your own 21st century, and the common belief that government is best suited to educate human beings, we find today conservative bad boy Kevin Williamson, former National Review correspondent, arguing not just for private education, but for the beneficial unintended consequences of the United States government going bankrupt. Williamson, disliked by virtually everyone, from objectivists for his disparagement of Ayn Rand, to liberals for having said that women who undergo abortion should be hung or hanged, and by many protectionist nationalist Republicans for being against Donald Trump and in favor of free trade. Here, in the end is near and it's going to be awesome, how going broke will leave America richer, happier, and more secure, argues provocatively that the coming bankruptcy of the United States should not be feared but rather embraced for many positive consequences he envisions. Williamson begins his extended argument by highlighting Leonard Read's classic article, I, Pencil, in which Read pointed out the inevitable interconnection of all of us in modern economies by the fact that no one single person even knows how to make something as relatively simple as a number 2 pencil. But that division of labor facilitates the private sector in its constant improvements. Williamson points out that Gordon Gekko's famous Motorola telephone brick, which in the 1980s was state-of-the-art, had very little talk time, needed its own purpose-built briefcase, and you couldn't play Angry Birds on it. Similarly, the most budget-conscious automotive rice box we can buy today, a Toyota, Hyundai, or Mazda, is vastly superior to a 1950s Mercedes. Why does this progress happen? Because it's in the nature of the private sector to constantly innovate and improve. But if we turn to the public sector, what do we find? We find incompetence and lack of innovation at every turn. We find the astonishing case of Ori Feibush of Philadelphia, whose municipal government refused to clean up its abandoned lot next to his coffee shop, claiming he was the owner, fining him for not cleaning up their own trash on their own property, and when he went to the trouble of cleaning up their lot himself, demanding he return the trash to the lot. That, says Williamson, is the essence of government. Another example would be that of lemonade stands run by kids across America to raise money for childhood cancer. Those lemonade stands shut down for not having food permits. And would 9/11 have happened if American Airlines and United had been in charge of their own security and financially liable for it? He doubts it. I do too. So why does the public sector fail to innovate? Because it's a huge set of monopolies, with often no way of leaving them. And why is government set up that way? Because, he argues, traditionally government has dealt with public goods, which people have believed can only be supplied by government. He argues, however, that the private sector can provide many public goods without a problem, referencing A, private parks that are used by the public at large, such as New York's Highline Park and New York's Central Park, formerly public, but now thriving in the hands of a private trust. B, New York's Starbucks as public restrooms. C, the provisioning by organized crime groups in some instances of the services of government. D, the work of sociologist Robert Ellickson, who showed that in Shasta, California, ranchers used effective private ways of dealing with other ranchers when their cattle trespassed. And E, the fact that many private court or conflict resolution systems have existed, past and present, in the U.S. and elsewhere, which companies and individuals often use and which are superior to their governmental equivalent. He argues, probably rightly, that liberals deny these realities, saying, conventional political theory holds that only the state can provide public goods such as parks, sidewalks, roads, and the like. Television commentator Rachel Maddow offered a typically exaggerated expression of this view when she visited the Hoover Dam. And so his conclusion is, the majority of what the federal government does can be taken over by cooperative enterprise, right now. So having dealt with the issue of public goods, like national defense, which actually only make up about a quarter of governmental expenditures, he then turns to the other 3/4 of government expenditures. So, for example, anyone addressing the future insolvency of the United States has to address one of the biggest elephants in the room, Social Security. Pensions, of course, can easily be supplied by the private sector. So Williamson demonstrates this public inefficiency by pointing out that the first person ever to get Social Security, Miss Ida Fuller, like the first person in any pyramid or Ponzi scheme, made a killing. Fuller paid $24.75 in Social Security taxes during her working life before going on to collect $22,888 in benefits. The problem with Ponzi schemes, of course, is that there is no money for the people at the bottom, the last ones in. As he says, Social Security entered a stage of permanent deficit in 2011, meaning that taxes flowing into the system will never catch up to benefits paid out. Of course, private retirement funds and pensions aren't hard to fund, they just Take slow and steady savings, let's say 10% of your wages, starting at an early date and then relying on the magic of compound interest. Secondly, of course, one of the main reasons that the U.S. is going bankrupt is the highly inflated costs of medical care, which again is not a public good. And one of the reasons healthcare costs so much is because so few people know what procedures actually cost, because no one is cost conscious. As Williamson says, there are almost no consumer prices in healthcare. Because there are no prices, there is no price discrimination by consumers, and therefore no pressure to keep prices down to where consumers can pay them. I went into great detail on this in my recent review of John Goodman's book, Priceless. Yet another reason that people are not cost-conscious is that people pay so little out-of-pocket expenses for some of their average procedures. As he says, why not go to the doctor for those sniffles when it only costs you a $10 copay? And again, here in medicine, we find the same lack of innovation that occurs in all of big government, with patients, for example, in the medical system constantly needing to fill out paper forms before receiving treatment. Williamson says, I can open my gun safe with a thumbprint and make a $1,000 purchase at the Apple store without touching a piece of paper. But the guy poking around my insides and prescribing me drugs is using the same technology as Charles Dickens. True. Thirdly, education. Williamson points out the ever-increasing price and ever-declining quality of American public education at all levels, and its role in the onrushing American bankruptcy. In 2022, total educational spending totaled over $2 trillion, compared to defense spending of under $1 trillion. This expensive incompetence flows directly from its coercive spirit, exemplified by the 19th century American education reformer and progressive thinker Calvin Stowe, who said, "A man has no more right to endanger the state by throwing upon it a family of ignorant and vicious children than he has to give admission to the spies of an invading army." Naturally, Stowe believed, as did many 19th century progressives, in the Prussian system of public education. And history shows us what happened. Prussia started 2 world wars and then threw Western civilization into chaos for over 30 years, partly as a result of its aggressive nationalism, created and spread by both its lower and higher systems of public education. Williamson points out the hypocrisy of many liberals in supporting public education, but then in sending their own children to private schools. President Obama and Michelle famously used the expensive Sidwell Friends School for daughters Malia and Sasha, while at the same time maneuvering to eliminate the DC Hope Scholarship Program, a very popular initiative that gave thousands of uniformly poor and mostly black inner-city Washington students alternatives to the dangerous and pathetic Washington, D.C. public schools. Similarly, it's not surprising that nearly half of public school teachers in Philadelphia enroll their own children in private schools. Incidentally, Williamson also argues that since public schools are financed largely with property taxes, and since the poor often rent their apartments, thus indirectly paying the property taxes of their landlords, the poor are not getting free education, but actually paying through the nose for the educational garbage their children often receive. Moving to deficit spending, Williamson points out that it is in effect a form of taxation without representation, since the unborn taxpayers to be encumbered by those obligations do not have a political voice. And that may be why Gen Z generation polls relatively cynically about government. Adding to those deficits are, of course, the huge pensions that public sector workers and unions are receiving, mandated by law. So in Ohio in 2031, pension costs will take up 55% of expected tax revenues, and in some jurisdictions, pension costs are expected to exceed all tax revenues in the coming decades. But what happens then if you try to raise municipal taxes to pay for the pensions of firefighters, policemen, and city workers? As he says, Philadelphia has lost a quarter of its population since 1950, in no small part because of the city wage tax, which sent the middle class scuttling out to the suburbs. Which means that at every level of government, city, state, and federal, government has promised too much. Just as California promised its DMV clerks and its assistant directors of dietetics nice fat retirements, the U.S. government has made very generous promises to Americans in the form of Social Security and Medicare benefits. At some point, those promises will prove to be so utterly empty as the Social Security Trust Fund is becoming. And what will happen with the federal debt? He answers that there are three possibilities. One is by explicitly defaulting on creditors. The second is monetizing the debt and entitlement liabilities, which means artificially creating money, debasing the coin of the realm, and nominally paying those benefits in increasingly worthless dollars. The third is implicitly defaulting on taxpayers, eliminating the entitlement programs as we know them, which would probably mean, at the very least, limiting payments to the very poor. So in conclusion, what in the end shall we make of his book, in which he provocatively gives us many very detailed and interesting examples of governmental incompetence and discusses fiscal constraints and possible outcomes? I would give it a C+, B-, noting, however, the following issues. Number one, in the very title of his book, he implies bankruptcy is near and is going to be awesome. But then he makes very different statements inside the book. A, he says that if the U.S. defaults on its creditors, there will be catastrophic consequences. But how could that be if everything will be awesome? B, he says, alternately, if the country tries to inflate its debts away, then that could be enormously socially disruptive. Does that sound awesome either? Of course, when Germany tried hyperinflation in the 1920s, it got Adolf Hitler. C, he says, if the U.S. simply refused to recognize its entitlement debts, Social Security, Medicare, public sector pensions, and the like, then that too would prove socially disruptive and have serious economic consequences. Yes, but would that be awesome? Number two, he says the fiscal realities in the United States mean that we'll be forced to deal with a deep retrenchment in our expectations about what government can do for us. Perhaps, but I'm not sure that people will conclude this. When Mexico and Greece came close to defaulting, did citizens in those countries understand that big government was the problem? Not necessarily. Now, the emergence of Javier Milei in Argentina is a hopeful sign, but that transition is very far from complete. So one of his assumptions, that the citizenry of the bankrupted country will conclude that big government is bad, is not clear. Number three, he ignores the fact that in the Anglosphere, the West used to be just the way he wants it to be in the future, with small, limited governments, low taxes, and private institutions performing many of the roles that government does now. America, at the time of its founding, had, thank God, no Social Security, Medicare, or public education, and in the 19th century, superior private equivalents emerged. And so an urgent issue for him is to explain how American society changed, going from almost perfect in the 19th century to having a big, inefficient government in the 20th. How did that happen? Number four, he claims that the Industrial Revolution happened because farmers had the right of exit from the countryside, saying, a 2,000-year period of economic stagnation was broken in a matter of years, and the world was changed. We can do that again. But this explanation fails because A, Europeans had the right of exit from the countryside long before that, and B, because they left the countryside not because they suddenly could, but instead because you could make much more money and have a better life in the cities. Number 5. Throughout the book, he refuses to use the concept of natural rights or property rights to define the proper limited role of government. Nowhere does he justify this treatment, and he should, since it makes much more sense this way. In addition, he at times comes close to arguing that there can be no objective rule of law. It's all just a question of consensus. This, too, is mistaken, but would make sense if he doesn't believe in natural rights. Similarly, of voluntary exchange, he says, voluntary exchange is not an ethical principle. It is only a process. This, of course, is false. Respecting property rights is utterly moral and the very foundation of civilization itself. Very concerned for my part, as I observe you from Doctor Who's TARDIS, that citizens throughout the 21st century, Anglosphere, continue to ignore their ever-increasing mountains of national debts. I bid you well, and remain the Scarlet Pimpernel.